The silk veil trembled as Greta Thornwood stood at the stone altar, her thick fingers clutching the fabric so tightly that her knuckles paled beneath her green skin. And though she tried to hold back the tears, they came anyway, hot and shameful against her cheeks. The human village elders had gathered in a tight semicircle around the ancient shrine, their faces carved from disapproval and barely concealed disgust, while the man beside her, this stranger named Kael Yarrow, shifted his weight from one foot to the other with obvious discomfort. She had never wanted this, none of it. Not the arranged marriage to a human farmer, not the exile from her clan for the crime of being born to a mother who had dared to show mercy to human travelers, and certainly not the humiliation of standing here like livestock being traded for peace between two settlements that would never truly trust one another. The village priest droned on in his monotonous voice, reciting words about duty and unity and the bonds of matrimony. But Greta heard none of it over the rushing sound of blood in her pointed ears. She was 20 years old, strong enough to break a plow horse's yoke with her bare hands, and she had been reduced to this, a bargaining chip, a living treaty. Her father had negotiated the arrangement with the human settlement after border raids had threatened to escalate into full war, offering his daughter as proof of good faith, and the humans had accepted only because their best farmland lay adjacent to orc territories, and they needed the guarantee of safety. Kael Yarrow was a veteran of some distant campaign, a man who had lost his wife to illness 2 winters past, and apparently he had been willing to take on an orc bride in exchange for an expanded land grant and the forgiveness of his debts to the village collective. She felt his eyes on her now, this man who was about to become her husband, and she refused to meet his gaze. Let him see her cry. Let him witness the depth of her misery. Perhaps it would satisfy whatever cruel curiosity had driven him to agree to this arrangement. The priest asked for their consent in voices that brooked no refusal, and Greta heard Kael respond first, his voice steady and lower than she had expected, rich like turned earth after rain. When the priest turned to her, she could barely force the words past the tightness in her throat. "I consent," she whispered, and the lie tasted like ash. The priest pronounced them bound, and the witnesses dispersed with unseemly haste, as though proximity to an orc might contaminate them even in this supposedly sacred moment. Greta stood frozen, her veil still concealing her face, until she felt a gentle touch on her elbow. She flinched instinctively, years of human hostility teaching her to expect violence, but the touch remained light, almost hesitant. "We should go," Kael said quietly. "My farm is 3 miles west." "The wagon is ready." She finally looked at him then, really looked, and found a man in his late 20s with dark brown hair that curled slightly at his collar, sun-weathered skin that spoke of years working outdoors, and pale gray eyes that held something she could not quite identify. Not cruelty, which surprised her. Not disgust either, though she had braced for both. Instead, there was a kind of weary resignation, as though he too were a participant in a script neither of them had written. He was tall for a human, broad across the shoulders, with the lean muscle of someone who earned his bread through honest labor rather than sitting in comfortable halls. "Fine," she said, keeping her voice flat and emotionless. She would not give him anything more than she had to. Not cooperation, not kindness, and certainly not hope. The wagon ride passed in oppressive silence. Kael handled the reins with practiced ease, guiding the 2 draft horses along a rutted path that wound through fields of young wheat and barley. The land here was fertile, Greta noted despite herself, rich black soil that would yield generous harvests if tended properly. They passed several other farmsteads, and she felt the weight of hostile stares from humans working their own plots. A woman herding geese actually spat in their direction, and Greta's hands curled into fists against her thighs, her small tusks grinding together as she fought the urge to respond. "Ignore them," Kael said, breaking the silence for the first time since they had left the village. "They will adjust eventually." "Will they?" Greta shot back, unable to contain her bitterness. "Or will they simply learn to hide their hatred better?" He did not answer immediately, and when he did, his voice carried a note of something that might have been sympathy. "Probably the latter, if I am being honest, but hatred expressed quietly is still better than violence, and violence is what we are trying to prevent." "How noble," she said acidly. "I am so glad my entire life could be sacrificed for your community's comfort." She saw his jaw tighten, saw the muscle jump beneath his skin, but he kept his eyes on the road. "I did not say it was fair. I did not say I was happy about it either. But here we are, and we can either make the best of it or make each other miserable. I would prefer the former." "Your preferences are noted," Greta said coldly, and they did not speak again for the remainder of the journey. Kael's farm materialized from the late afternoon haze like something from a painting. A sturdy timber and stone house with a thatched roof, a well-maintained barn, fields stretching in neat rows toward the tree line, and a vegetable garden that showed signs of careful tending despite the obvious absence of a woman's touch. Everything was functional rather than beautiful, built to last rather than to impress, and Greta found herself grudgingly approving of the pragmatism, even as she resented everything the place represented. Kael brought the wagon to a stop near the house and climbed down, then extended a hand to help her descend. She ignored the offered assistance and jumped down herself, her boots hitting the packed earth with solid thuds. He withdrew his hand without comment and began unhitching the horses. "The house has 2 rooms," he said as he worked. "The main room has the hearth, table, and my bed. There is a smaller room in back that I use for storage, but I cleared it out yesterday. I brought in a cot and some blankets. You can sleep there." Greta turned to stare at him, genuinely confused. "What? Your room?" he repeated patiently, leading the first horse toward the barn. "I assumed you would want privacy." "We are married," she said slowly, as though explaining something to a child. "You have certain rights now." Kael stopped walking and turned to face her fully, and for the first time she saw a flash of something hot and angry in those gray eyes. "I have no rights to anything you do not freely give," he said, his voice hard as stone. "We may be bound by law and custom, but I will not touch you without your wholehearted consent, and I suspect that consent will not be forthcoming. So you will have your own space, and you will sleep safely, and we will figure out how to live together without making each other more miserable than necessary." "Is that clear enough for you?" she blinked, completely thrown off balance by the vehemence of his declaration. This was not how she had expected this conversation to go. Every story she had heard about forced marriages, every warning from the few orc women who had been traded to human settlements, had prepared her for demands, for violation, for the brutal assertion of ownership. Instead, this strange man was offering her sanctuary. As if he could read the confusion on her face, Kael's expression softened slightly. "You were crying behind your veil," he said more quietly. "At the altar, I saw. And I need you to understand something, Greta Thornwood. You are safe with me now. Whatever you have heard about humans, whatever you fear from this arrangement, I will not hurt you. That is my promise to you, freely given on my honor as a man." The tears threatened to return, and she hated herself for the weakness, hated him for the unexpected kindness that was somehow worse than cruelty would have been, because she did not know what to do with it. She swallowed hard and nodded once, sharply, then turned away before he could see her face crumple. "Where is this room, then?" she asked, her voice rough. He showed her to the small back room, which was indeed barely large enough for the narrow cot, a wooden chest, and a small table with an oil lamp. But it was clean, the blankets were thick, and there was a latch on the inside of the door. A latch. He had installed a lock that would keep him out and keep her secure. The significance of that small piece of metal was not lost on her, and she felt something crack in the armor she had built around her heart. That night, lying awake on the cot while darkness pressed against the single small window, Greta listened to the sounds of Kael moving around in the main room. She heard him bank the fire, heard the creak of his bed ropes as he settled in for sleep, heard his breathing gradually slow and deepen. She waited for the sounds of footsteps approaching her door, for the test of the latch, for the proof that his words had been lies designed to lower her guard. But the sounds never came. He simply went to sleep, and eventually, hours later when exhaustion finally overcame vigilance, so did she. The days that followed established a rhythm that Greta had not anticipated. Kael rose with the dawn and made a simple breakfast of porridge and bread, leaving half in the pot for her to eat when she emerged from her room. He worked his fields through the morning, came back for a cold midday meal, then returned to work until dusk. He spoke to her only when necessary, asking if she needed anything, informing her of his plans for the day, and otherwise leaving her to her own devices. It was not companionship, but neither was it hostility. It was a careful, negotiated distance that allowed them to coexist without constant friction. Greta found herself at loose ends. She was accustomed to hard physical labor, to working alongside her clan in the communal fields and workshops, and the forced idleness made her restless and irritable. On the third day, unable to stand the confinement any longer, she ventured out to the vegetable garden and began pulling weeds with perhaps more violence than the task strictly required. The garden was a disaster by orc standards, with rows that wandered drunkenly and plants competing for space in a way that reduced everyone's yield. She set about fixing it with grim determination, tearing out the weakest specimens, redistributing the others to optimal spacing, and constructing proper support structures for the climbing beans. She was so absorbed in the work that she did not notice Kael's return until his shadow fell across the row she was reorganizing. She looked up, defensive words already forming on her tongue, but he simply surveyed her work with an appraising eye. "That looks much better," he said finally. "I have never had a talent for gardens. My late wife Elara managed all this. After she died, I did my best, but clearly my best was not very good." It was the first personal information he had volunteered, and Greta found herself curious despite her determination to remain aloof. "How long ago did she die?" 2 years this autumn, Kael said, his voice carefully neutral. "Fever took her. She was sick for 3 days and then she was gone. We had no children, which was probably a mercy. It would have been harder to manage alone with little ones. You miss her?" Greta asked, then immediately regretted the question. It was too personal, too invasive, but Kael did not seem offended. "Every day," he said simply. "But life continues whether we wish it to or not. Grief is a luxury I cannot afford during planting season." He paused, then added, "If you want to work the garden, I would be grateful. And if you want something more substantial to do, I could use help with other tasks. The north pasture fence needs mending, and I am behind on mucking out the barn." Greta considered refusing out of pure stubbornness, but the truth was that she needed the work as much as he needed the help. Idleness was its own form of torture. "I will take the fence," she said, "and the barn, but I am not doing it for you. I am doing it because I will go mad sitting idle." "Your reasons are your own," Kael said with the ghost of a smile. "The work will be done either way. So Greta threw herself into physical labor with the same intensity she brought to everything. She repaired the fence in half the time Kael had estimated, her orc strength making light work of posts that would have required 2 human men to maneuver. She cleaned the barn until it gleamed, organized the tools that had been scattered haphazardly across various surfaces, and even repaired a broken stall door that Kael had been working around for months. She worked until her muscles burned and sweat soaked through her simple linen dress, worked until she was too tired to think about her situation or her future, or the fact that she was trapped in a life she had never chosen. Kael, for his part, seemed content to let her find her own way. He expressed appreciation for the completed tasks, but never demanded more or criticized her methods. He continued to maintain the respectful distance between them, sleeping in his own bed, eating his meals without expecting her to cook them, and generally treating her like a capable partner rather than a servant or a possession. It was bewildering and unsettling in equal measure. 3 weeks into their marriage, a group of human men from the village appeared at the farm just after dawn. Greta was in the barn feeding the horses when she heard raised voices from the yard, and she crept to the door to listen, her heart suddenly pounding with old, familiar fear. "We are just saying you should keep a closer eye on her, Yarrow," one of the men was saying, his tone aggressive. "She was seen on the road yesterday, heading toward the forest. Who knows what she was doing? Could have been signaling her people, planning another raid." "She was gathering mushrooms," Kael said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I asked her to. The chanterelles are fruiting early this year by the oak grove. Would you like to see the basket she brought back, or would you prefer to continue making accusations based on nothing but prejudice?" "Prejudice." Another man sputtered. "We are trying to protect this community. These creatures cannot be trusted." "This creature," Kael said, emphasizing the word with clear disdain, "is my wife. She is a member of this community now, whether you like it or not. And she has worked harder in 3 weeks than some of you manage in 3 months. So unless you have actual evidence of wrongdoing rather than fearful speculation, I suggest you leave my property." There was a tense silence, and Greta held her breath, waiting for violence. But instead, she heard the sounds of retreating footsteps and muttered complaints growing fainter. Only when they were clearly gone did she emerge from the barn, finding Kael still standing in the yard, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, and his jaw tight with suppressed anger. He turned when he heard her approach, and some of the tension left his shoulders. "I am sorry," he said. "They had no right to come here making demands." "You defended me," Greta said, and she could not keep the wonder from her voice. "You called me your wife." "You are my wife," Kael said, as though it were the simplest fact in the world. "That means something to me, even if it means nothing to you yet. It means I will stand between you and anyone who wishes you harm. It means your safety is my responsibility, and I do not take that lightly." Something shifted in Greta's chest, some careful barrier beginning to crack. She had been prepared for many things in this arranged marriage, but not for a human man who would defend her against his own people. Not for someone who would claim her publicly as his when it would have been so much easier to appease his neighbors by keeping his distance. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you do that? You do not even know me." "No," Kael agreed. "But I know what it feels like to be alone and afraid. I know what it feels like to lose everything and have to start over. And I know that you did not choose this any more than I did, but you have faced it with courage and dignity. That deserves respect, Greta. It deserves protection." The tears came then, sudden and overwhelming, and Greta was mortified to find herself crying for the second time in front of this man. But Kael did not mock her or tell her to be strong. He simply stood there, a solid, steady presence, and when she finally raised her head again, he was holding out a handkerchief with an expression of gentle concern. "I do not understand you," she said, taking the cloth and wiping her eyes. "Every human I have ever known has treated my kind like animals, but you treat me like a person." "That is because you are a person," Kael said, and there was a hint of exasperation in his tone now, as though he could not understand why this needed to be stated. "You think, you feel, you work, you dream. What else would you be? A monster," Greta said bitterly. "That is what they call us, savages, beasts, things to be driven off or exterminated." "Then they are fools," Kael said bluntly, "and I have never had much patience for fools." Despite herself, despite everything, Greta felt a laugh bubble up from somewhere deep in her chest. It was a small, broken sound, but it was genuine, and she saw Kael's expression brighten in response. "Was that a smile?" he asked, his own lips quirking upward. "I was beginning to think you had forgotten how." "Do not push your luck," she warned, but there was no real heat in the words. The dynamic between them began to shift after that day. It was subtle at first, just a gradual thawing of the careful formality that had governed their interactions. Greta began eating her meals at the same time as Kael rather than waiting for him to finish. They started talking during their work, sharing observations about the farm and the surrounding land, occasionally even exchanging stories about their respective childhoods. Greta learned that Kael had grown up in a military family, that he had served 5 years as a soldier before buying his discharge to marry Alara and take up farming. Kael learned that Greta had been training as a smith before the arrangement forced her to leave her clan, that she missed the heat of the forge and the satisfaction of shaping metal to her will. One evening, nearly 2 months into their marriage, Kael returned from the village with a heavy bundle wrapped in oilcloth. He set it on the table with a meaningful thud and gestured for Greta to open it. Inside, she found Smith's tools, a full set of them, from hammers of various weights to tongs and files and chisels. They were not new, but they had been well maintained, and they were of decent quality. She stared at them in disbelief, then looked up at Kael with wide eyes. "The blacksmith in the village is retiring," he explained. "He heard somehow that my wife had smith training. He said these tools were not doing anyone any good gathering dust in his shop, and he would sell them cheap to someone who would actually use them. I thought, if you wanted, you could set up a small forge in the barn. Nothing elaborate, just enough to do repairs and small projects. It would save me having to go to the village every time something breaks, and it would give you something to do that you actually care about." Greta ran her fingers over the smooth wooden handles, feeling the weight of the hammers, the balance of the tongs. These were good tools, lovingly used and carefully preserved. The gift spoke of thought and consideration, of Kael paying attention to what she had said weeks ago in a casual conversation and remembering. "This must have been expensive," she said quietly. "The repairs you have made around the farm have saved me 3 times what I paid," Kael said dismissively. "Consider it an investment. Besides, I like the idea of having a smith on site. It makes the farm more self-sufficient." But Greta knew it was more than that. It was an acknowledgement of who she was, of the skills and identity she had been forced to leave behind. It was Kael saying, without words, that he saw her as more than just a bargaining chip or a source of labor. She set the tools down carefully and looked at him, really looked at him, seeing past her own defensive walls for perhaps the first time. He was not handsome in the classical sense, with his weathered face and the small scar above his left eyebrow, but there was kindness in his eyes and strength in the set of his shoulders. He was a good man. She had not expected that. She had not prepared for it. "Thank you," she said, and the words felt inadequate, but they were all she had. "You are welcome," Kael replied, and the warmth in his voice made her chest ache in a way she did not fully understand. They built the forge together over the next week, Greta designing it based on the communal forges of her clan, and Kael doing the heavy construction work under her direction. It was a partnership, real collaboration, and Greta found herself laughing more often, relaxing into easy conversation, even initiating contact like touching his arm to get his attention or standing close while they worked. The awareness between them grew, subtle but undeniable. She caught herself noticing the play of muscles under his shirt when he swung a hammer, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the timbre of his voice when he spoke quietly in the evenings. And she saw him noticing her in return, his gaze lingering on her face when she was focused on her work, the careful way he moved around her as though afraid of crowding her, the small gestures of consideration like ensuring there was always hot water for washing after a day at the forge. The first frost came in late autumn, arriving overnight and painting the fields in shimmering white. Greta woke to find her small room bitterly cold, her breath misting in the air, and when she emerged, she found Kael building up the fire in the main room's hearth. He looked up as she entered, taking in her shivering frame, and frowned with concern. "That back room has no heat source," he said. "I did not think about how cold it would get. You cannot sleep there through the winter." "I will manage," Greta said, though her teeth were chattering slightly. "Do not be stubborn," Kael said, straightening up. "You will freeze. There are two options. Either I set up a bed for you here in the main room near the fire, or you share my bed and I will sleep out here. I am not going to let you suffer from cold out of some misplaced sense that you need to maintain your own space." Greta hesitated, pride warring with practicality. The thought of sharing Kael's bed still carried complicated feelings, but the nature of those feelings had changed dramatically over the past months. She was not afraid of him anymore. If anything, she was afraid of her own growing attraction, of the way her heart raced when he smiled at her, of the dreams she had been having where his careful distance finally crumbled. "I do not want to drive you from your own bed," she said slowly. "And I trust you to keep your word about not touching me without consent." Something flashed in Kael's eyes, something hot and quickly suppressed. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice rougher than usual. "I am certain," Greta confirmed, and she was. That night, she lay in the large bed that had belonged to Kael and his late wife, acutely aware of the man beside her, of the careful foot of space he maintained between them, of the sound of his breathing in the darkness. She lay awake for a long time, thinking about everything that had brought her to this moment, about the unexpected turn her life had taken. She had entered this marriage as a prisoner, and somehow, without her quite noticing when it happened, she had begun to feel like a partner. Like someone who belonged here, like someone who might impossibly be falling in love. "Kael," she whispered into the darkness. "Yes." His response was immediate, suggesting he too had been lying awake. "Thank you for keeping your promise, for letting me have time to adjust, for not forcing anything." There was a pause, and then she felt the mattress shift as he turned toward her, though he still maintained the distance between them. "Greta, I need you to understand something. When I made that promise, I meant it completely. But I also need you to know that somewhere along the way, this stopped being just about honor and duty for me. You have become important to me. I value your presence, your strength, your laugh. If you never want more than this current arrangement, I will respect that. But if you do, if you might someday want something more, I want you to know that I would welcome it. Gladly." Her breath caught in her throat, her heart suddenly pounding so hard she was certain he must be able to hear it. "What if I wanted more now?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "What if I have been wanting more for a while but was too afraid to say so?" She heard his sharp intake of breath, felt the bed shift again as he moved fractionally closer. "Then I would ask if I could hold you," he said carefully. "Just hold you. Nothing more unless you specifically asked for it. I would want to do this right, Greta. I would want to court you properly, to give you the choice and the time to be certain." "You have been courting me," Greta said, and she was smiling now in the darkness. "Every day, with every kindness, with every moment of respect and consideration. You have been courting me without calling it that, and I have been falling for you without admitting it to myself." "Greta," Kael breathed her name like a prayer, and then his arms were around her, careful and gentle but undeniably strong, and she was pressed against his chest, feeling his heart racing as fast as her own. She tilted her head up, searching for his mouth in the darkness, and when their lips met it was soft and questioning, a tentative exploration that gradually deepened into something more certain. His hand came up to cup her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with reverent care, and when they finally broke apart they were both breathing hard. "I love you," Greta said, the words spilling out before she could second-guess them. "I do not know when it happened exactly, but I love you, Kael Yarrow. I love your kindness and your strength and the way you see me as a person rather than a thing. I love that you defend me even when it costs you. I love that you gave me time and space and let me come to you freely." "I love you too," Kael said, and his voice was thick with emotion. "I have loved you for weeks, maybe months. I love your courage and your pride and the way you throw yourself into everything with such fierce determination. I love watching you work the forge, love the sound of your laugh, love the way you have transformed this house into a home again. I did not think I would ever feel this way about anyone after Alara died, but you have shown me that the heart can heal and love again." They kissed again, longer this time, and then Greta settled into his arms, her head on his chest, his hand stroking her hair with gentle repetition. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. "The village still hates me. Your neighbors still do not trust me. This world is not kind to couples like us." "Then we will face it together," Kael said firmly. "We will prove them wrong through our actions, through our life together. Change happens slowly, Greta, but it does happen. Someone has to be first, has to show that humans and orcs can build lives together, can love each other. Why should that not be us?" "Why not indeed?" Greta murmured, and she felt some of the fear that had been her constant companion for so long finally begin to ease. She was not alone anymore. She had a partner, a true partner who would stand with her against whatever came. That was worth more than she could possibly express. They made love for the first time that night, slowly and gently, learning each other with careful attention and growing confidence. Kael was patient and thorough, ensuring her pleasure before seeking his own, and afterward they lay tangled together, skin against skin, hearts beating in synchrony. "I am never letting you go," Kael whispered against her hair. "You are mine now, and I am yours, and no force in this world is going to change that." "Promise?" Greta asked, though she already knew the answer. "Promise," Kael confirmed. "On my life and honor, I promise." Winter settled over the farm with serious intent, bringing deep snows and bitter winds that howled around the sturdy walls of the house. But inside, Greta and Kael built a life together that glowed with warmth and contentment. They worked side by side during the short days, Greta at her forge and Kael at his endless round of winter maintenance tasks. They spent the long evenings curled together by the fire, talking and planning and occasionally arguing, because neither of them was particularly skilled at yielding ground, but always making up before they slept. They made love frequently and joyfully, exploring each other with ever-growing confidence and pleasure, learning what made the other gasp or moan or shudder with release. Word of their genuine partnership spread, and reactions were mixed. Some neighbors grew slightly more tolerant, willing to acknowledge that perhaps Greta was not the threat they had feared. Others hardened their positions, muttering darkly about unnatural unions and the corruption of human bloodlines. Kael met both reactions with the same steady resolve, refusing to hide or apologize for his love. When the village merchant refused to sell to Greta, Kael simply stopped patronizing that merchant and took his business to the next town over, making a point of explaining exactly why. When a group of men made crude comments within Greta's hearing, Kael challenged the ringleader to a public fistfight and won decisively, making it clear that insults to his wife would have consequences. Spring arrived with the usual burst of frantic activity, and Greta threw herself into the planting with enthusiasm, her strength allowing them to prepare far more acreage than Kael could have managed alone. She worked the forge during slow periods, taking on repair work from the few neighbors willing to overlook her green skin in exchange for quality smithing at fair prices. Word of her skills spread, and gradually more work came their way, grudging at first but growing more regular as people realized she was genuinely talented. One warm afternoon in late spring, Greta was at the forge working on a complex lock mechanism when she heard horses approaching. She looked up to see a group of orc riders, and her heart clenched with sudden, complicated emotion as she recognized her father at the head of the group. He dismounted and approached slowly, his expression unreadable, while Greta set down her tools with trembling hands. "Father," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Daughter," he replied, his deep voice exactly as she remembered. His eyes swept over the farm, taking in the neat fields, the well-maintained buildings, the forge where she stood. "You have built something here." "I have," Greta confirmed, lifting her chin with pride. "With my husband, we have built a life together." "This human treats you well?" her father asked bluntly. "You are happy?" "I am," Greta said, and she was surprised by how fiercely true it was. "He treats me with respect and love." "I am happier than I ever thought possible when you first told me of the arrangement." Her father nodded slowly, some of the tension leaving his massive shoulders. "I have heard reports. They say you are thriving, that your husband defends you against those who would do you harm, that you work side by side as true partners. I needed to see for myself." He paused, then added in a lower voice, "I am sorry, daughter. Sorry that I could offer you no better choice. Sorry that I sent you into such uncertainty. But I am glad, so very glad, that you have found happiness despite my failures." The words broke something inside Greta, some last bit of anger she had been holding on to, and she found herself stepping forward into her father's embrace, this giant of a man who had done his best in an impossible situation. "You did not fail," she said against his chest. "You found me a good man. You gave me a chance at a life I never could have had among the clan. I understand now why you did it, and I forgive you for the pain it caused." Kael emerged from the house then, clearly having spotted the orc riders from a window, and he approached cautiously but without fear. Greta pulled back from her father and held out a hand to Kael, drawing him into the circle. "Father, this is Kael Yarrow, my husband. Kael, this is my father, Greta Thornwood, chief of the Southern clan." The two men regarded each other for a long moment, and then Greth extended his hand in the human fashion. Kael took it without hesitation, and they shook firmly, a gesture of mutual respect between leaders of different peoples. "You have given my daughter a good home," Greth said. "You have my thanks for that, and my promise that you will always have safe passage through clan lands. Any who harm you or yours will answer to me personally. And any from the human settlements who threaten your people will find themselves unwelcome on my land and will hear my voice raised in opposition," Kael replied steadily. We are family now, through Greta. That means something. Grath's expression softened into something that might have been a smile. It does indeed. You are a man of honor, Kael Yarrow. My daughter chose well. He turned back to Greta. I will not take more of your time. I simply needed to see that you were well. But know that you are always welcome among the clan, you and your husband both. You have not been forgotten, and you have not been cast out permanently. Should you ever wish to visit, our fires are open to you. The ache in Greta's chest eased another fraction, this piece of her past reconciling with her present. Thank you, Father. That means more than I can say. The orc riders departed as suddenly as they had come, and Greta stood with Kael's arm around her waist, watching them disappear toward the forest. Your father is terrifying, Kael observed mildly. I was certain he was going to rip my head off for at least the first 5 minutes. Greta laughed and leaned into him. He likes you. If he did not, you would know. Probably because you would be dead. That is very comforting, Kael said dryly, but he was grinning. Summer arrived in full force, bringing long days of intense labor and short nights of deep, exhausted sleep. The crops flourished under their joint attention, and Greta's forge business continued to grow as her reputation spread throughout the region. They were not wealthy, but they were comfortable, and more importantly, they were happy. The simple joy of working together, of building something tangible and lasting, was more satisfying than Greta had ever imagined possible. One evening in midsummer, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Greta reached over and took Kael's hand. I have been thinking, she said quietly. That is always dangerous, Kael teased, but he squeezed her fingers gently. I am serious, Greta said, though she was smiling. I have been thinking about the future, about children. Kael went very still beside her, his full attention suddenly focused on her face. Children, he repeated carefully. You want children, with me? Of course with you, Greta said, rolling her eyes. Who else would I have children with? But yes, I want that. I want to raise a family here, on this land we have built together. I want to show the world that human and orc can create something beautiful and lasting. I want to leave behind more than just fields and buildings. I want to leave behind hope. Kael pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe, and when he spoke his voice was rough with emotion. I want that too, so much. I want to see you heavy with our child, want to raise sons and daughters who will be bridges between our peoples. Want to grow old watching them build their own lives. Yes, Greta. Yes to all of it. They made love right there on the porch, with the sky darkening above them and the crickets singing in the fields, urgent and passionate and full of hope for the future they were creating together. The seasons turned, as seasons do, and autumn arrived with its explosion of color and harvest activity. Greta and Kael brought in crops that exceeded all expectations, their joint efforts yielding abundance that would see them through the winter with plenty to spare. They hosted a harvest festival, inviting both human neighbors and members of Greta's clan, and though there was some tension and awkwardness, people from both groups slowly began to mingle and talk. It was a small thing, just the beginning of breaking down ancient walls of suspicion and hatred, but it was a beginning. As the last guests departed and they cleaned up in companionable silence, Greta felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. This life, this partnership, this love, it was everything she had never dared to hope for when she had stood weeping behind her veil at that arranged altar so many months ago. She had been so certain she was being sacrificed, thrown away for political expediency. Instead, she had found a man who saw her, truly saw her, and loved her not despite her differences, but because of the whole complex person she was. "What are you thinking?" Kael asked, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. his chin resting on her shoulder. "I am thinking that I am grateful," Greta said, leaning back against him. "For you, for this life, for the unexpected gift of happiness. I am thinking that I love you more than I have words to express." "I love you too," Kael murmured against her neck. "More than I thought possible. You have given me a reason to believe in the future again, to hope for something better. You have given me everything." They stood there together as full darkness fell, two beings from different worlds who had found each other against all odds and built something precious in the space between. Their story was not finished, would never truly be finished as long as they drew breath. But the foundation was solid, and the future stretched before them bright with possibility. In the months that followed, Greta discovered she was pregnant, and the joy that filled their small farmhouse was radiant and all-encompassing. Kael was impossibly tender with her, treating her like spun glass even as she continued to work and insist she was perfectly capable. Her father visited again when word reached the clan, bringing gifts and blessings, and even some of the human neighbors began to soften their attitudes as they watched the couple prepare for their child with such obvious love. The baby arrived in early spring, a strong, healthy boy with his father's gray eyes and his mother's green-tinted skin, small tusks just barely visible even in infancy. They named him Kieran, meaning Dark One in the old human tongue, and Greta thought it was perfect for their bridge child, their son who would belong fully to both worlds and neither. As Greta held her son for the first time, Kael beside her with his arm around her shoulders and tears streaming unashamedly down his face, she thought back to that terrible day at the altar. She remembered the despair, the tears behind her veil, the certainty that her life was over. And she remembered Kael's whispered promise, the first kindness he had shown her. "You are safe with me now." He had kept that promise in ways neither of them could have imagined. He had given her safety, yes, but also love, partnership, respect, and hope. He had given her a future worth living, a family worth cherishing, and a love that would endure whatever challenges the world threw at them. "Thank you," she whispered, looking up at him with eyes full of emotion. "For everything. For being the man you are, for loving me." "Thank you," Kael replied, kissing her forehead gently. "For giving me a second chance at happiness. For being brave enough to let yourself trust me. For giving me this beautiful family. I will spend the rest of my life proving myself worthy of you." "You already have," Greta said, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. Outside, spring rain began to fall, gentle and nourishing, blessing the fields that would feed them and the land that had become their home. Inside, the little family settled into peaceful contentment, secure in their love and hopeful for the future they would build together. It was not the ending Greta had expected when she stood weeping at that altar, but it was the ending she had earned through courage and openness, and the willingness to believe in unexpected kindness. It was, in every way that mattered, a happy ending and the beginning of a love story that would echo through generations to come.